Joining us now to discuss the Texas power grid and the conservation appeals is ERCOT's president and CEO, Pablo Vegas. Thanks so much for the time this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Brian. It's good to be with you today.
It's our pleasure to have you. Let's start with this. What factors lead ERCOT to issue conservation appeals like we've seen the last couple of days?
So when we see conditions on the grid where the reserves look like they could be getting low at a particular point in time, that's when we make a conservation call. And on a day like yesterday or today where we felt that the tightness on the grid was going to be a little more severe than what we have seen in prior days this summer, that's when we ask for an appeal. Appeal is essentially, it's an elevated ask for conservation. It's us trying to communicate that there is a little bit more serious concern in terms of having enough reserves on the grid for a particular point in time. And so that's why we did the appeal today. That's also why we did the appeal yesterday.
Do you expect those to continue through the weekend?
You know, the conditions that are leading to today are likely going to be persisting through the weekend. So what's going on today is we've got very high temperatures, as everybody can feel. We've got a high associated electric demand with that. And today, we're also seeing a very low wind forecast. Throughout the summer, we have typically seen the wind start to ramp up during the early afternoon. And as the sun sets into the evening, the wind continues to ramp up and kind of offsets that energy that the solar power was providing. Well, what we're seeing today is that the wind is essentially staying relatively flat through the solar ramp down period, and it's at a relatively low level. So the combination of both the very high heat, the associated high demand with that, and the low wind production is causing us to have some concerns about the availability of reserves throughout the evening.
What happens if the demand surpasses the supply or the reserves? It got pretty close yesterday.
Yeah, so what we do is we always maintain a set of power reserves on the side so that we never get to a place where we try to never get to a place where we don't have enough power to meet demand. Those types of reserves include additional power plants and resources that we can call up very quickly. It also includes demand response. So we do pay certain business customers and industrials and groups in order to be able to turn off immediately if we need them to do so. So we hold on to those reserves. And as we get through the late afternoon and into the evening today, we will likely be needing to use a good number of those reserves in order to make sure that we always have enough power to meet demand.
Progress has been made on getting more tools to help you manage the grid. What kinds of changes have been made recently in that effort?
So one of the things that we've just rolled out this summer is a brand new reserve service called ERCOT's Contingency Reserve Service, ECRS. And what that is, it's a very fast acting generating product or a load response product that has to be able to turn on in just 10 minutes, and it has to be able to run for 2 hours. So we started procuring that service earlier this summer, and we've really seen the benefit of it throughout the last few months. We've been utilizing it during days like today and yesterday, where when the solar ramp is happening, and if the wind isn't picking up enough or demand isn't coming down fast enough that we can turn these units on, they can very quickly fill in the gap. And that's one of the tools that we've recently used. We currently are also continuing our conservative operations where we'll call up reserve power resources earlier in the day to let them know, hey, we may be needing you later on tonight. So we make sure that we have everything online and ready to go just in case we need it.
Here, a KVUE Defenders story recently talked about how transmission constraints limit electricity flow, increasing cost. What sorts of areas have the largest congestion, and how do you overcome that?
So we have seen some congestion develop over the course of this summer. One of the areas that has been somewhat problematic has been south of San Antonio. And when we have a circumstance where there's a lot of wind production and energy production coming out of the coastal bend area, and a lot of demand in the Dallas and the San Antonio, Austin, and Houston area, we've seen some congestion develop on the transmission lines. What we do is we work very closely with the transmission companies across the state to plan out what we anticipate the growth to be in each region of the state. And then we put together plans in terms of developing transmission. We have one of those transmission lines actually going to be proposed at our board meeting this next week, where it's going to be addressing specifically that South San Antonio congestion. historically, we've also seen a little bit of congestion between the west side of Texas and the north part of Texas. All of the wind and the solar that's been developed in that part of the state needs to get into where the load centers are, which is closer to Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, and Houston. And so again, those are areas where we continue to plan out ways to develop transmission lines to alleviate that congestion.
Now, one of our reporters heard that the lines aren't being used to their capacity. The companies are being curtailed when there is actually space on a transmission line. First, is that true? And if so, what's the reason for the curtailment?
So the only reason that ERCOT would ever curtail, or the primary reason that ERCOT would ever curtail flow across the transmission line is if there's a concern of overloading it, meaning that there's too much power going across it for what it's rated. At ERCOT, we use something called dynamic line rating, which means that we factor in the temperature outside and conditions in the weather as to how much we can actually run power across a line. That's a more advanced method of how to run a transmission system, and we do that here in ERCOT. So we are leveraging our transmission system to its fullest, and we'll continue to do so.
Final question. Again, thanks so much for answering these questions for us. What about unplanned power outages? How often are you seeing them, and how much of an issue does it cause when plants go down suddenly?
Yeah, Brian, that's something that we always have to anticipate could happen at any given point in time. And it is really one of the reasons why, we might consider a conservation call, because if we see that, in the morning that we think that it could be a little bit tight, but something could go wrong that we're not planning for. And that's why we do things like a conservation call. So it has happened periodically throughout the summer. I can tell you yesterday, the performance of power plants has been very good. The amount of unplanned outages has been lower than average these last couple of days. So that's been a real help in keeping the power flowing. That and the really great response from Texans across the state when we made these conservation calls has really made a big difference.
ERCOT President and CEO Pablo Vegas, thank you so much for joining us here on KVUE this afternoon. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Brian. You do the same. Take care.
We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.